Welcome to the Leo Training Podcast with Joe DeLeo. You'll hear in-depth interviews and tips from world-class athletes, coaches, and industry-leading experts to help you train smarter and improve at what you love to do. Train smarter, get stronger, move better, race faster. Here's your host, Joe DeLeo.
We're back for episode 84. In this interview, Dr. Stuart McGill returns to the show to again lend his wisdom and expertise to the rowing community. We focus on one central topic during our discussion, and that is how to enhance athleticism in rowers. You will walk away from this interview with some great actionable training recommendations to improve your performance, as well as increase your longevity in the sport of rowing. On a side note, Stu and I kicked this episode off with a bit of a laugh as he wishes me a very early happy birthday. Thanks so much, Stu. Without further ado, let's roll to episode 84, Enhancing Athleticism in Rowers, with Dr. Stuart McGill. I am very excited to welcome back a returning guest to the Leo Training Podcast, Dr. Stuart McGill. I've been very fortunate over the past year to get to know Dr. McGill a little bit more, as well as attend some of his seminars in person. So, Stu, thank you so much for taking the time out of your extremely busy schedule to come back to the show.
Good afternoon, Joe, and to you, happy birthday, sir. Now I've given it away to the world.
Thank you. Yes, the 4th of July we just celebrated in the US of A, so America and myself thanks you. And happy birthday likewise to you and your fellow Canadians.
Right. Well, I was talking about you, not your country.
Oh. Well, no,
yeah.
I'm September 2nd.
Oh, is it? It came up on the Skype feed as today was your birthday. Anyway, we'll pass on that.
So before we kick things off, why don't we have you kind of catch the audience up a little bit? It's been just over a year since our last interview, last May 2016, and you've been extremely busy. You've recently retired after, I believe, 32 years from the University of Waterloo, as well as been teaching around the world. So is there some things you'd like to just kind of share with the audience of what you've been up to in the last year?
I see patients in our home clinic here in Gravenhurst. We left the university a couple of years ago, and I teach clinical courses, as you know, the 3 levels of what are called McGill courses. And my favorite new job is I am Catherine's driver, water boy, and boat mechanic. So as you certainly know, my wife is a master's rower, and we have great fun going to the different masters regattas around North America.
Excellent. Fantastic. So with that, let us move kind of and set the stage for the rest of our discussion this evening. So to build on that, I would love for you to take a moment and kind of provide a little bit of an overview of your work. You're well known for the research that you've done in spine biomechanics, but lesser known to the audience in rowing community is your work in the clinic and then also with athletes across many different sports.
Okay. I was a professor, and we had a research clinic as well as the lab. We would assess athletes from different sports from around the world, and very elite athletes, as I might add. And of course, everyone who came to see us came for a pre-existing back issue. But nonetheless, we learned a lot in terms of what distinguished them from the average people. I can give you one example. The public thinks being stronger is better, and you'll hear that a lot on Facebook discussions. And yet, we found with the very best athletes, they had what we called sufficient strength. And when we measured them, they weren't the strongest, but they had other attributes. And one of them, this will sound strange to some of your listeners, was stiffness. They were elastic athletes and had their body a tuned elastic spring. So, I hear discussions about lengthening hamstrings and stretching muscle and that kind of thing. And yet, when we measure different athletes, we find that they are very clever and perhaps lucky in tuning strategic elasticity in their body so they load, store energy, and recover it, and can really propel an object like a baseball or a football. It can create incredibly hard impact like MMA athletes, or produce power in an oar in a rowing shell. So there are strong rowers and there are elastic rowers. Two different animals. Some have long legs and shorter legs, tall torsos and shorter torsos. Some have what we call a large ape index with longer arms. So, all of these discussions are really constrained when people have opinions about, oh, this is the optimal training program, this is the optimal rowing style. It really depends on all of these different factors that might make a different rower very successful, and yet the same style training regimen for the next rower will be very unproductive, both in terms of injury resilience and performance enhancement. Anyway, that's what we did for many years. So I hope that answers the athlete issue, and it really enabled us to couple that with our work on injury mechanisms. We were able to probe and assess the injury mechanisms and work to reduce those in the athlete, both stylistically and in their programming, let the pain desensitize, and then rebuild their foundation for their athleticism with whatever it was that was lacking previously. So that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah, one of the things that I've always been fascinated with and really appreciate with the approach that you take is identifying those mechanisms in each individual and building a individualized program, because as you would say, it depends on kind of what their specific needs are or what their specific pain triggers may be.
Right. I don't really know how I can comment on that, Joe. That's a good summary.
Okay. So moving into what you've just mentioned and building into that. So let's discuss some principles for training a rowing athlete. So could you just start, and you mentioned briefly before about being strong and elastic. And could you kind of describe or provide a definition of or give an example of what those two things are so the audience can understand?
Yeah, well, let me give you a start with an analogy, say, from a jumping sport. Let's say if you took a volleyball team and I said to you, I'm a coach here, train my volleyball team, and I want every player to jump 2 inches higher, increase their standing vertical jump 2 inches. And you might choose a squat program. Every player does exactly the same squat program. What you will find is about half will add a little bit of height to their jump. And in there will be a spectrum of a little height to quite impressive height gains. About 40% will actually lose a bit of height off their vertical jump, and then 10% will make no difference. Had you asked one question, you would have been able to know which ones would have done well on the squat training, which ones wouldn't, and therefore you would have chosen a completely different program. Had you said to them, all you players who are naturally strong, you stand over there. All you players who are naturally quick, you go stand over there. Now, you can probably guess which group gained the increase in their standing vertical jump. It was the naturally quick. So when you add strength to quickness, you got higher level performance. But when you add strength to strength, you actually add slowness and a bit more stiffness. So when we go to a sport like rowing, it is a game of storage and recovery of elastic energy. Your job is to produce power, peak power when the oars are at 90 degrees to the boat, because if you do it too early, you pinch the boat, and if you do it too late, you pull the boat apart through the riggers. The optimal drive comes at 90 degrees. And when you measure the great ones, they produce this tremendous pulse of power and unleashing of elastic energy that has been stored. And when you look at all of these storage mechanisms, the oars themselves will bend and store a little bit of energy, and you want them to unleash that energy optimally. The rower, think of the whole sequence. You move up the slide into compression, and there is a storage of elastic energy. Well, if you look at some of the masters men, they have a big belly. It collides into their thighs. They get a wonderful storage of elastic energy. Don't you dare mention the word transverse abdominis and sucking it in. I would do the opposite. Get recoil and recovery out of the compression. And then as the hips pulse, so if I can show with my hands, the athlete is up the slide into compression. And then, as they're approaching, they're mid pull now, and the hips explode. And if the hips explode, if the spine is appropriately stiffened and is tuned to be a perfect short-range stiffness spring, as the hips explode, it will actually bend a bit, store a bit of energy, and whoomp, it becomes a slingshot. Now, that's a sequence of timing. You require tuned stiffness. You require a pulse out of the hips, etc. And then that pulse, really, when you measure it, the arms haven't really started the finish yet. And sending the boat, as you know, with maybe, again, with each athlete, it's slightly different. A little bit of scapular depression at the end, and really finish off the spring unleashing of elastic energy. Now, there is the rower who is a strong rower, and they row with muscle. That's quite a different stylistic. Those are the ones that row with more what you call the C shape to their spine, and they are forced to pull with more muscle. Well, if you're a strong athlete and you don't have much elastic potential, that's probably your best bet. Is it the most injury resilient? We can have a discussion on that if you wish. But anyway, that's a start on the elastic storage and recovery, and it has to suit the athlete's body, but it certainly has a big impact on how you would coach, how you would match athletes, say in a crew versus a single, and a little bit on injury resilience. It's all in there, but is that a start on the elastic discussion?
Absolutely. Yeah, I knew that was a key point, and one I'm glad that you explained, because I think people had a little bit of, from our first interview over a year ago, a little trouble kind of understanding that concept. So that was very helpful.
Yeah. So but you see that all the time. You know, I laugh when I see football players, say a quarterback, doing deadlifts, and you think a deadlift is to stiffen your body. And yet to throw a football, you must be an elastic athlete. And I've never seen a power lifter yet who can throw a football or hit a golf ball or row for that matter. So again, it's tuning the body. You adapt the optimal athleticism through the training program. And yes, and don't misquote me and say the athlete can be weak. I never said that. But again, you optimize the performance based on whether they are naturally strong or naturally elastic. And I think athletes generally know that, but certainly a good coach will see that immediately.
Absolutely. So my next question is, how do we evaluate and then begin to train the elastic storage in rowers to help build injury resilience and enhance performance?
Well, I mean, that's a huge question. And there's a lot of intangibles in all of that. And it's funny, when you talk to the good coaches, they say, we know it when we see it. And I say, good, now describe it. And they can't always. They just say they know good rowing form when it's matched to that particular body type and individual. But generally speaking, the blown out, non-elastic strength athlete will go into a C, and they use and row with their back muscles through the range of motion, pulling with muscle. The elastic athlete will sit a little bit taller. And when you watch the hips explode as it comes down the slide, you will actually see a little bit more of elastic storage into the spine, and then whoomp. Now, the great coaches, you take Charlie Francis to use a track and field example. Charlie was a fantastic sprint coach, and most famous probably for the whole Ben Johnson thing. But Ben Johnson was a fantastic sprinter. People forget that. And Charlie would listen to Ben coming down the sprint track, listen, and determine when training stopped, because he didn't want to pollute that beautiful high speed rhythm and pattern with a little bit of a fatigued pattern where the footfall was a little bit heavier. A great rowing coach will tell you exactly the same thing. They can hear what they call the whoomp. And that's, you know, when a boat starts to fly, and it's not the big, strong athlete who's pulling massive erg scores that creates that sound, that beautiful whoomp. And the whoomp is, and sorry for this analogy, but again, it's the hips firing and then just whoomp, and you can hear it in the boat, and then the boat just picks up and flies, and now it's up to the coach to determine the run and all the rest of it, as you know, weather and all of the other things that are tuned, not only at a macro level for that particular athlete, but for the day and the weather as well. But you can even hear that great storage and recovery in a boat. So that's rather fluffy, I know. But it goes with how the athlete sets up in the boat, and you can see basically the three phases with, you know, the catch, the drive, and the finish of how that energy is stored and recovered. And the whole idea is you want to do all of that with minimal energy losses. So as the spine bends too much, that's an energy loss, and you're right back into pulling with muscle once again. And then I can use another great analogy from the track and field world. The fastest runners have the stiffest feet and ankles. They just off the ground store and recover. A stiffened spine will do exactly the same thing. It becomes a kangaroo would be an example from the animal kingdom, where when it walks slowly, it actually uses more muscle, more energy is consumed, and it's an awkward, slow gait. But when it tunes the elasticity in its body, it bounds at great speed, much less energy is utilized. And that's a little bit of what I'm trying to describe in the rowing stroke. So again, you have the strong rowers who are very successful, but I would submit that they should be trained differently, tuned differently, and stylistically coached differently. When it comes to injury resilience, we can get into injury clusters and that sort of discussion if you like, but there's a little more of a thought.
That was great. So is there anything that we should be looking for to tune the flexibility and stiffness when looking at the athlete? Like you gave the example with the basketball players in terms of, you know, these are the strong ones, these are the quick ones. So right. Is there a similar thing that we could look at for rowers?
Sure. Yeah. If you have a strength rower, and they don't really have the elastic body, I think you're going to have to focus a little bit more on strength training And these are the ones who live and die by, doing things like deadlifts and that kind of base training. When you get the more elastic athlete, I would then recommend going more for the Olympic style of lifting. Now, when you measure a power lifter, a deadlifter from an Olympic athlete, the Olympic lifter is an elastic athlete. And they pulse. They pulse to get the bar moving off the ground. They completely relax to get the speed to get under the bar for the catch. And then they stiffen again. They're very tuned to stiffening, relaxing, stiffening, catching the bar, producing pulsed strength. And they are highly tuned elastic athletes. They aren't the strength lifters of the old days when the Olympic lifts included the military press, for example, when we go back to 30 and 40 years ago in the Olympics. So that changed the whole elastic strength athlete. But then things like, would you do, again, base strength training with deadlifting with the elastic athlete? I'd be going up and down, I'd be bounding up and down the stadium stairs with no weight. And I see too many coming to see me now who've been bounding in the gym with 50 kilos on their back. It's insane that some trainer has thought they're going to jump up and down with a bar on their back. And that will use so much of the training capacity in a person's back. There's not much left over for anything else. And then they say, okay, well, now we're going to go out to the boathouse, rig a boat, and go for a row. Well, hold on, fella. You just took a whole lot of capacity out of that athlete. They need a big recovery after that kind of thing. Whereas if they bounded stairs, they would, again, tune their bodies and get that hip storage and recovery through a stiffened core. So you, as you can imagine, you can't push a rope. It doesn't work. But you can push a stiffened entity, like you can certainly hit a stone. And that's kind of, it's a bit extreme, I know the example. But a tuned torso with the hips firing in a more pulse-like fashion will create a much higher peak force on the oar when it counts at the 90 degree. So we've talked about bounding, we've talked about strength and deadlifts, Olympic lifts, things like kettlebell swings. We were the first to document the mechanics and joint loads and muscle patterning in kettlebell swings. It is a fantastic exercise for producing the pulsing of strength. Now, of course, there are different styles of kettlebell swings. As you know, I'm great friends with Pavel Tsatsouline. He's taught me much over the years, and I hope he would say the same. And he has, as you know, there is what's called the hard style in kettlebell swinging. I would suggest that hard style is probably not appropriate for the average rower. It would be a much more relaxed style of swing through the hips with appropriate core stiffness, but not the big tucking and flattening of the spine, which Pavel does to produce what's called an Okinawan style of strength and resilience. I would not do that to a rower, given the other volume and exposure to spine flexion that they have. So I'm going to respect that volume, trying to build a larger training capacity and back off that element of the hard style of kettlebell swing. As you know, we've done work with building supreme core endurance in different athletes. MMA athletes would be a good example, where that turbo helicopter exercise that you've seen me workshop for time. We would also consider somewhere in that rowers program there has to be a gassing exercise. And what I mean by that is one that really takes them to fatigue in a safe way. So we don't want to pollute the rowing stroke by polluting their motor control system with an old, tired, fatigued rowing stroke. But I'm going to fatigue them another way, so I don't pollute that. And the turbo ball helicopter gassing exercise would be one example. Another one might be a hand over hand heavy rope pulling in of a sled. But the coaching cues there to the athlete is do not break form. You're going to get gassed. You're going to breathe hard, but thou shalt not break form. So it is a mental discipline, is a mental toughness. You know, the rowers who fall apart in the last, couple hundred meters and they lose the race. But those who have the strength of mind to keep form are the ones who are more injury resilient and have the success over the final push to the finish line. So that's mental as much as it's physical, but absolutely an essential part in my view. So we've talked about endurance, strength versus elastic pulsing stiffness. I think we can. I think you mentioned mobility earlier. It's so interesting. You look at the young fella who was the halftime show at the NBA All-Star game this year. He's considered the most extraordinary dunker on the continent. Well, I know him fairly well. And when you look at the leg raise and you measure, hamstring flexibility, he is as tight as a drum. There's been coaches who say, oh, you should stretch your hamstrings. And I said, don't you dare listen to those people. Those are your gift. Those are your springs. Keep tuning them. And I would suggest the same with rowers. So I've heard people say, oh, slacken off the hamstrings. Wait a second now. That hamstring is all part of the spring that we're talking about. So if the athlete has heavier thighs and those thighs are colliding into a heavier torso, you'll need a shorter hamstring. If they're longer in the leg, skinnier leg, more lithe in the torso, they may need more mobility. But I don't know of a single rower yet who goes up into compression is limited by their hamstrings. It is much more likely the hip joints themselves and not the hamstring muscles. But it's so interesting. Can I just finish off that thought, yes, Joe? And then, I think about psoas and some of these other muscles that, you watch a rower get out of the rowing shell. That will tell you their mobility. When they get out and they can't stand up, they walk their hands up their thighs. They're struggling to get an upright posture. Their psoas muscles are spasmed rock hard. I pay a lot of attention to that because it tells me they stole a lot of their athletic capacity in the last half of the race. They became so antalgic and they were stuck, and you see it when they get out of the boat. You've seen me do our psoas mobility work, for example, and we know psoas under heavy repeated backload and a little bit of pain and fatigue becomes facilitated. That is a pattern that we've measured. Well, some athletes have a heavy elastic fascial connection through their body to psoas. So when we do a hip extensor stretch, and then we push the arm, we rotate the arm and shoulder back. But if I can just show my hand here on Skype, and then you rotate the hand around in this fashion, that will change their psoas tension and they can feel it. So those types of elastic potentiated athletes would have quite a different psoas stretch than the strength athlete who it didn't matter. And you would see that as soon as they got out of the boat at the end. Likewise with hamstring, etc. But anyway, I like to see the athletes get out of the boat and stand up. Those are the ones who gave it at the end, not the ones who are getting out looking very, actually quite crippled. And it takes them quite a bit of time. So somewhere along the line, that should be addressed either in changing their programming, look at their style, etc. Is it the same for everybody? Absolutely not. But this is what makes coaches great.
Right. Absolutely. So there's several points in there that you made that I would love to kind of circle back to because I thought they were fantastic. So one was you talked about the pulsing. So I'll pick on myself. I was lucky enough to go on stage at the Perform Better Summit, and what you described with the the coaching that you were kind of working with me on stage there, was you were actually trying to get me to relax a little bit more than I normally would in a hard style kettlebell swing, and really focus on, as we would say, the keen at the top of the swing, that pulsing. So really, I felt like I was enhancing or elongating the amount of time I was relaxing during the swing cycle, if that makes sense. Would that be more indicative and helpful for rowers in terms of the drive recovery and the learning that pulsing effect?
Yeah, see, now you're trying to give me a general answer, and I really can't till we have an athlete in front of us. But if we had, again, that very heavy strength dominant athlete, and you were trying to get a bit more pulsing elasticity into their body, then I would try and, through different drills in their brain, create this pattern of pulsing muscle. The sharper the pulse, the keener it's learned as a motor skill. So, again, just the relaxation drills, and then you might get stiff and strong and then try and throw a punch. If you use muscle, you can't do it. But as soon as you poof, let it go, boom, or just to learn to pulse, and then start using those thoughts as you're perfecting the power stroke, and getting a little bit of core control, and then letting the hips fly.
Right. So the other question that I had that you mentioned, you talked about the having the stiffness into the hamstrings. So getting into a good catch position in terms of compression, being able to go through, either a body weight squat or a goblet squat would be kind of a good, would you say, prerequisite to being able to move through the necessary range of motion in the rowing stroke, compared to trying to force a rower to be able to get to, 90-degree angle for active straight leg raise or a toe touch?
Yeah, well, the answer to that absolutely is it depends. You're going to see a study that I'm publishing with a colleague, so I'll preempt it a tiny bit now. But when you compare a half squat with a deep squat, and he trained younger folks over a period of time, when you do a half squat, it teaches body stiffness. It teaches more core endurance, because you tend to relax at the bottom of the squat. It's not, you're into elastic tissues once again. So that's one thought if you want to train a half squat over a deep squat. But the deep squat simulates going up into compression and the catch. That for a large extent is dominated by anatomy. What's the depth of the athlete's hip socket relative to the femur? So once they collide, as you know, we have a lot of rowers with FAI, femoral acetabular impingement, and some of them will have to stop because of that. As you know, we always do a hip exam, which is basically lay the athlete on their back and do a hip scour of the femur around the acetabulum to determine the shape. With that, we can set optimally the feet in the stretchers, the turnout angle, all of these kinds of things to try and optimize the hip joint, because when the hip joint runs out of room, any remaining motion has to go into the spine. Well, now that forces you into a greater load on the discs. And as you know, those teams who are either coached or by anatomy row with a bigger C shape in their spine, the incidence of discogenic troubles increase. And, we've seen that when, with my work with international teams, they bring in a coach who stylistically changes the team, and they lose a few of them through disc troubles. Anyway, there's a little bit of a thought, but going up into compression, I've never seen an athlete that I can think of where they're limited by a hamstring tightness because they've so fully flexed the knee. And when you fully flex the knee, it slackens off the hamstrings.
Right.
But even if there was tension in the hamstrings, I would figure out a way to take advantage of that. I love stiffness and that muscular tension, because now you've got elastic tension and forces adding to the muscular concentric contractions.
Excellent. So final point I would love for you to touch on, and I think this is very important to address in regards to the rowing community and coaching. And I understand this very well, having read your work as well as been to your seminars in person. But could you just explain from a functional perspective why, as athletes, we do not want to hollow or draw the navel or belly button in towards the spine to activate the TVA?
Yeah, well, first of all, why on earth would you want to activate the TVA? What is the scientific reason for doing so? Now, if someone could give me a reason, I would listen to it. What it came from was a study in Australia suggesting that people who had back pain had a delay of 30 milliseconds or something in onset. But that was a very, very artificial experiment, a very small group of people, and people couldn't replicate that in larger population studies. So somehow the athletic world got an idea that the TVA was seminal for spine stability, creating proximal stiffness and all of these kinds of things. But it was an absolute myth. If you don't believe me, do a squat, suck in your belly, and try and stand up. Versus the opposite. Just stiffen your belly and compress. Take in air to about 70%. Compress down. Don't suck in, and you'll find your squat goes way up. So in rowers, it is the most performance inhibiting thing they can do is to suck in their belly or draw up their pelvic floor or whatever other cue would be issued. Now, say they're going to get sick halfway down and they want to vomit. Good. Use your TVA. Right. That's why you have a TVA. It allows you to vomit, yell loudly, defecate, do these kinds of things. But the whole abdominal wall is involved in tuning the short-range stiffness spring of the abdominals, building intra-abdominal pressure, etc. So, as you know, you're a strong first trainer. I know you power breathe, you potentiate athletic potential, never by drawing in, but by power breathing, stiffening the abdominal wall appropriately, allowing the diaphragm to then contract, compress, and what you're doing is storing elastic energy. And then you let that elastic energy unleash strategically to enhance the athleticism, the power, the speed, the force.
Outstanding. So that brings me to my next point. So if that's inhibiting and we want to build elastic energy and teach an athlete stiffness, we would start with the big three. Correct?
Well, that's an interesting viewpoint. Where did the big three came from? I was asked to write the spine stability program in the early 90s for the American College of Sports Medicine. So this is very old. And I searched around measuring different exercises to create core stiffness. So we were measuring stability. What exercises actually produced core stability? And another word for rowers is tuned stiffness. But we had to do it in a way that was spine sparing because the design of the program was intended for people with back pain. So that it wasn't for performance enhancement in its original form. Then we would trial it with different athletic groups. And what we found was when you do the big three 10-second repeated holds, it creates a tuned stiffness in the core. and that tuned stiffness stays for an hour or so. So, as you know, with our girls, we have them do the big 3 before they get in the rowing shell. It adds a little bit more stiffness, so they store and recover elastic energy to produce the slingshot. And I think the results speak for themselves, Joe, but I'll stop bragging about those girls. The listeners should know that was really a joke. My wife and her sister, who are the North American Masters Pairs champs, do not listen to me one little bit in terms of training tips. So I'm her husband. I don't know anything. Anyway, but when you run and cut, you will run and cut a little bit more crisp, a little bit faster. You're now unleashing distally the athleticism when you can lock the core down a little bit better. And a quick analogy would be there. Take a uniarticular muscle like pec major that crosses the ball and socket joint. Proximally, it attaches the rib cage. Distally, it attaches to the humerus. So if I was going to push, I'll do a pull, like a rowing pull in a minute, but a push. Distally, it flexes my arm around, but proximally, it bends my rib cage towards the joint. So consider a push. If all I used was my bench press muscle, I would collapse and leak energy proximally, and distally, I would bring my arm around rather weakly. However, if I stiffened my core, 100% of that muscle activity would go to a push. The same thing works for a pull. Exactly the same thing happens for every muscle that crosses the hip. So that's why when you run and cut, boom, you have stiffness. Or if you want to jump, go to YouTube and watch Michael Jordan dunk a basketball, taking off 1 foot from the top of the key. You will see this heel planting into the ground, not his toes, his heel taking off from the heel, a hip-centric gluteal muscle pulse, which is the hammer hitting a stone, which is the core. And you'll see with a lot of the guys who get a bit older and they're losing their jumps, more core stiffness training coupled with hip power pulsing, it gets their mojo back. And it isn't as clear and definite as that for a rower, but certainly at a more subtle level, the hammer and the stone analogy and that whump that produces boat speed is what it's all about. Now, and I'll just backtrack 1 second to clarify that absolutely there are the strength-based rowers. They have a different tone to the boat, a different shape to their spine. Do they last longer in the sport? I don't know. Some athletes, as you know, they're just touched by the hand of God and that they are bulletproof. But anyway, there's, I hope, an answer.
No, that was great. One other thing you could touch on with the big 3. Now you mentioned that when an individual does those exercises, it helps to enhance the stiffness in the abdominal wall, 1 to 2 hours.
Well, and it's in the whole back. It's the back side, the side, QL, the obliques, and the abdominal muscles. It's that 3-dimensional guy wire system and corset around the core. But I want to build that elastic cylinder and make it a little bit more elastic and short-range elastic. So when the hips fire, as I said, you're going to get a little bit of a storage into the torso and then a better recovery of that elastic energy.
Right. Thank you for correcting me on that. So, but long-term, cumulatively, it also has an effect. So if an athlete or an individual commits to doing those exercises on a consistent basis, doesn't it also cumulatively help to build up the stiffness as well?
Well, the evidence I have to answer that is it depends on the current state of training of the athlete. If they're already highly tuned elastically, it won't make a hell of a lot of difference. So we took Muay Thai fighters, and they had already done a lot of base core work. It didn't really measurably enhance their stiffness when we measured it. However, they hit the bag a little bit harder, which was interesting after that training trial. But when we took a group of graduate students, and the state of our average graduate student at university, that made a huge difference in tuning their core. So obviously, as you and increase the elitism of the athlete, the law of gain is lower.
Right. That makes total sense. So is there any other exercises or drills? You mentioned the kettlebell swing, turbo ball training that you felt would help to enhance the pulsing, timing that would be helpful to a rower?
Well, again, there's all kinds of things, but I would need to see the athlete. If I've got really long levers through their legs, I'm going to have to take care of their knees a little bit because they are already predisposing their knees. So would you be doing a back squat with them with the shorter legs? Would you be doing a front squat? So say you had a really strong type of rower who you weren't working much on elasticity and they were real knee drivers. Not hip drivers, really knee drivers. I would be doing front squats with them. So do you see it? Give me the athlete and we will survey them, assess them, look at their style, look at their anthropometrics, look at their natural gifts, and write down in priority what will enhance A, their performance, and B, their injury resilience. And then we will go and choose tools that will get us to enhance them in the most efficient way. So given that particular athlete, I'd be looking at front squats and maybe stadium stair bounds with a different style. Maybe arms in front like this with a more upright bound, more knee dominant, etc. We could do all kinds of plyometric work, once again, looking at the total volume of their training and mitigating overload of any one joint through volume and stylistic change. So really the sky's the limit, Joe. I do maybe some, well, as you know, I love heavy pushes. Yes. So when you get an athlete like a rower, I wish they'd just spend more time pushing a car. Now, that teaches them foot stiffness, gripping the ground. It teaches athleticism through the leg. You've got to have a stiff core. It teaches frontal plane strength that you don't get when you're just in a barbell. Now, I know there's 2 feet into the shoes on a rowing shell. I get that. But when we've measured this, injury resilience is enhanced when you can balance the athleticism in the core from the front, the sides, and the back. When you get on one leg and you push a car and you take a step, that frontal plane athleticism produces injury resilience. We've measured that in NHL hockey players, for example. Of all the cases of abdominal tears, they've only been in hockey players who couldn't hold a side plank 1 minute. Those, a study done by a colleague of mine at the university, Professor Callahan, showed that anybody who has deficit frontal plane athleticism in their core will break to pain when standing sooner. We've got a lot of evidence to show that the balance within the front, the sides, and the back are important. Anyway, to push a car balances that.
Excellent. Is there anything?
I'd be spending less time doing deadlifts and those kinds of things with a rower, and I'd seriously consider heavy pushes, sled pushes.
Okay.
And pulls, by the way.
Yeah, I know the heavy rope pull on a sled or some other type of device. That's a great exercise in and of itself, but also for the gassing, as you mentioned earlier.
Oh, yeah, I'm going to give you a little secret. I don't give this one away very often, but walk backwards pulling a sled, pushing through the knees. You will exhaust your quads. Turn around and then pull forwards. Your brain will go right to the glutes and the hips because you've already pre-exhausted the quads. You do that routine and then tell me how many deadlifts and squats you need to do.
I'm writing that one down.
Yeah, no, you give credit where it's due on that one.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
That'll be all over the internet, I'm sure, and some trainer will say he's invented it. But anyway, that's how we progress athletes when all they can do is walk out of being quite back disabled. We get them on the walking program, and the progression is to walk backwards up a hill, then walk forwards up the hill, then go to sled drags backwards, pushing through the knees, and then forwards, really engaging the core and the glutes. So there's a terrific three-dimensional balancing program for you.
Fantastic. Is there anything else that you would like to touch on in regards to elastic energy storage or tuning the stiffness before we move on to talk about injury clusters or posture?
No, don't think so.
Okay. So posture in the rowing stroke is definitely.
I hate listening to myself. I just think I have too many opinions. So if you're going to ask me to volunteer, I'm going to say no. I don't have any more opinions. I'll try and answer your questions.
Okay. So in regards to injury clusters and looking at postures for in the rowing stroke, so there's kind of the two sides of the coin. We have as trying to get as much of a neutral spine as we can in the rowing stroke, and then we have rowers who have what we refer to as the C spine. Is one better than the other? How does that impact the injury that may occur for the athlete in terms of the posture that they may be holding during the rowing stroke?
Yeah. Well, we're dealing with a game of optimization here, for sure, between maximum performance and maximum injury resilience. First of all, to study groups and the injury clusters is always clouded by natural selection. So if a younger rower gets into a program where the coach insists on a certain style, those athletes who don't suit that style drop out because they get hurt. So we never see them as competitive athletes. And there's always this survivorship bias when looking at these. But someone like myself who gets asked to be a consultant to different, to say Olympic programs where I've worked with a few around the world. And I've also seen coaching changes where you've got a certain group of athletes who maybe were sitting a bit taller in the boat. And then the coach comes in and really emphasizes a long reach catch, big compression, etc. So he's now really changed the shape of the spine for that rower group of rowers. Well, they realize we're selected to be a higher sitting, elastic storage and recovery kind of rower, and he just turned them into a strength rower. And I think what you'll see, because I'm called in as a back performance consultant, is going to be a much higher short-term incidence of herniated discs. So that's a problem. And then you get some athletes who row with the C shape, and they're the survivors, and they survive very well. They can go through their career and become a master's athlete, and they seem to survive very well. So I guess that's a little bit of a start on it. To change the style is a real problem. But generally speaking, those who avoid heavy spine flexion, as a rule, will survive longer. And I'm hedging on this. I'll say on average. So if you just take the average back that hasn't gone through a selection process, they will have a longer career if they can avoid the heavy spine flexion, with the notable exceptions, of course.
And like you mentioned before, a lot of the way that the athlete is going to be moving through the rowing stroke is going to come down to their hip architecture, how much they're hinging through the hips and how much that they may have a C shape to their spine versus more upright.
And their elasticity.
Yes.
That's huge.
Okay.
Yeah. So as I said, if they're strength and they just row with muscle, but if you take an elastic athlete and put them in that big C, I suspect you will get a cluster of injuries around that.
Interesting. is it possible to, and would we even want to, based on what you just shared, to try to get into a neutral posture in a rowing shell? And I ask this question because when we're in a training facility like a gym and we're picking up, a kettlebell or a barbell, we want to be stiffening the torso in a good neutral spine posture. Is that something we want to try to replicate in the rowing stroke?
Well, the answer is it depends, but I'm trying to give a set of guidelines to all this. And
Sure.
No, of course, when you're training in the gym, generally speaking, we want to enhance training volume. And you do that by avoiding injury mechanisms. Now, there are some coaches who believe in tickling the dragon's tail. Approach the injury mechanisms, but they're going to get burnt a little bit that way. So generally speaking, you want to try and increase tolerable training volume. And how we approach that is to be a bit more pristine when they're in the training room, training, pushing load, pushing speed, training, pushing reps, and just a general more intense to the whole training exposure. When you then need to transfer that into the athletic world, and in this case the rowing shell, you're playing that optimal game. If you have that elastic athlete, they're a more lankier, rangier athlete where they do have this elastic ability. It will be better, and you will get a better storage and recovery of elastic energy if they aren't sitting in the big C shape.
Right. Okay.
So when the hips fire, you will see the spine actually load into elastic flexion. And you will see a little bit of recovery out of it. You want to see that spring, boom, boom, if you know what I mean.
Yes.
But when they are fully into the C shape, they've got no option now but to use muscle. And if they're a strength and endurance athlete, you will find those, again, muscle-based athletes who will do reasonably well, but they're going to have to work a little bit harder on more strength, more endurance, and hope to heck that their discs survive.
Okay, that was great.
See, Joe, there's a biological tipping point. Every single system in the body has a tipping point, and that tipping point is different for every single person. And as you know, it depends on their injury history, their training volume, their age, who their parents were, joints above and below, body segment length ratios. I mean, so many variables. And the coach's challenge is always to train the athlete below their tipping point. Now, if you really shoot the mark, you don't get a winner. You get a winner the closer you go to the tipping point. But when you cross the tipping point, it's, you've created an injury or something that will, the tipping point might be just in just a general neural fatigue that so steals their performance. Anyway, I'm trying to search for a wise answer, but probably the philosophical guideline would be think of all of those variables that determine where the tipping point is located, and then figure out the best way to optimize increasing the tipping point and then training within it. You've heard me say this before. Great coaches create a high capacity and then respect the capacity by avoiding injury mechanisms so they really use all of it. The bad coaches fail to create training capacity. They allow sloppiness going on in the training room, in the weight room, and so now they've already used up rowing capacity, not even in a rowing shell. And or you get the other kinds of coaches who the training is done in the rowing boat, and when you become so unidimensional in your training that way, you do run the risk of overdriving the capacity, because that's what's exposed every day. I mean, I can give you a prime example of that. I had an Olympic discus thrower fly in, and I went through pain provocation with them, and I couldn't get pain out of their back in all standard tests. And I said, "Oh my Lord, what causes your back pain?" And he says, "Well, it hurts when I do this." So he winds up and shows me the discus throw. And I said, "Well, how many times do you throw the discus every day?" He says, "Oh, about 100. And I said, "There's your problem." So you are training your athleticism with the event. So now you've overloaded the system that's required for the event. And really what we did was we said, the only time you throw is to express the athleticism that you've developed in the training room. Now we've mitigated all the injury mechanisms, and we can now enhance performance. But you failed to create the foundation outside of the athletic arena. And I would say the same thing with rowers.
That's great. So the one thing I would ask you to kind of build upon that is knowing that the primary kind of objective is to enhance the performance in the sport of rowing. What do you have some general guidelines in terms of how we want to balance what we're doing on the strength and conditioning side versus on the ergometer or in the rowing shell? You know, obviously they're not going to be training in the gym 6 days a week because they're not a power lifter, they're not a strength athlete. They're doing that to complement and build injury resilience and hopefully enhance performance on the erg or in the boat.
Wow. Again, I'm probably going to repeat myself a little bit on that one. First of all, a comment on the ergometer, and it's not me saying this. The more the time you spend on the ergometer, the greater your risk of back troubles. So, well, why is that? There's all different kinds of theories on that, but I think to pull a big erg score, you produce a square wave of force on the handle of the erg. Not so to create a fast boat. As you know, it's more of a triangular pulse shape. So that's going to use up a lot of training capacity. You build training capacity by using good form. You build training capacity by appropriate rest periods to adapt. You do it by very clever peaking and tapering periodization through the rowing season. Again, I wish some of the masters athletes, no individual being identified, would take time off after the competitive season is over. Let it detune for a month and be confident in getting back the base athleticism, then getting all of the body back in tune, and then refining it, getting down to the very short strokes of the season. But anyway, there's some summary principles that's not news to anybody. However, how many people are really considerate of each of those factors? And I do know with some athletes, for example, I'll have a strategy meeting with them and I'll say, well, what races do you need to win? And they say all of them. And I say, well, that's why you're injured. So we now are going to have to be much more strategic. And you only got one peak in your body because of your history of back injury and whatnot. So let's agree that we will use these other races as training races. Let's play some psychology. Let's not play all your cards and get the other rowers quite confident. But you are going to peak for the one that matters, for the big win. So, I mean, there's just another example of a strategy that's I use that much more, say, with an NHL hockey team. When I say that they'll hire me and say, well, we had 5 back injuries last year for the playoffs, and right away my training bell goes off, and I think, okay, you used them up through the season. When did you strategically rest those players? and I'll have a conversation with a coach. Well, what was your strategy to peak for the playoffs? And they it's like I hit them with a bat. They said, well, we have to win every game. And I said, but that's why you don't have players left for the playoffs. So play the strategy, guys. Anyway, just some thoughts.
No, that's great. That makes perfect sense to me. I remember, I guess it was 2 or 3 years ago now, maybe a little further back, but the last couple of years, the San Antonio Spurs, their core three of Tony Parker, Manu Ginobili, and Tim Duncan. And I remember reading some of the articles in sports news, and Greg Popovich, the head coach, was catching so much flack at the time for resting those guys early in the season, but he also realized that they were much older. They needed the rest, and he needed them to be ready at the end of the season into the big push for the playoffs and for the championship run. And those last couple of years, that's what he did, and he kept those guys a lot fresher throughout the year, and it worked.
And I might add, injury resilient.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. We do that time and time again. The stories I could tell you from the NBA.
Excellent. Well, Stu, do you have any final thoughts or special considerations you want to touch upon for the elite athlete versus the masters athlete to kind of summarize or wrap up?
Well, the major one that comes to mind is the masters athlete probably needs more consideration for rest and recovery. A lot of them won't admit it, and that is probably a big one. And there's all kinds of strategies that will be new to them to be able to get their body to respond positively, stay below the tipping point, etc.
Well, fantastic. We've touched on all our topics. Did you want to discuss? I know you've recently released some companion videos to your book, Back Mechanic, that came out, I believe, in mid to late spring in April. I saw them on the website.
Yeah. Well, as you know, I'd written the textbooks for docs and in the athletic world, and lay people were picking up those books and said, oh, could you write a book for us? And I never intended to. And I don't think I'm particularly well suited. I tend not to be the best communicator to the lay public. But I spent 5 years trying to preserve integrity, that it isn't easy to fix back pain. But if you give a proper assessment and use the assessment and knowledge of the pain triggers to avoid them and allow them to desensitize, and then use that information to build the foundation for pain-free movement later, you can be successful with most painful backs. Well, the book was quite successful, and you can read the reviews on Amazon, and people say it really helped them, but they would say, still, we need it to come to life. So I hired a video company, and we shot a sequence of all of the self-assessment tests, and then movement strategies to increase pain-free training volume, and then morph those into patterns that we proved transferred to real life. So, you can do these various movement tests and screens and whatnot. How do you know the correctives will help you to pick your baby out of the crib in the morning at 2:00 for feeding better than had you never done the correctives? We've measured what transfers. And we've also measured what transfers to occupational and athletic tasks. So it was a matter of getting all of that into the video. So that was, people asked for it, and they needed it to be visual and come to life. And I think we sell slightly more now of the book enhanced with video than we do just the book.
Fantastic. That's great.
Yeah, I'm slowly paying off my video bills.
Did you want to also discuss the upcoming McGill 3 seminar at Kabuki Strength later this year?
Oh, out in Oregon. Well, that's Chris Duffin's gym, and people may know Chris as he's just, again, a guy who's touched by the hand of God, absolute Hercules, and the things that he can do and be so strong and so injury resilient is mind-boggling. But nonetheless, he's invited us out to do a performance seminar for a day, and I'm fairly flexible or dexterous when it comes to discussing specific sports. So if anyone wants to discuss rowing, send me an email and I'll ask Chris to bring in an ergometer. It's the best we can do in a gym, I suppose. And we can do a little bit of stylistic training and some of the auxiliary exercises and have discussions. But that's probably really going to focus on building the non-negotiable core stiffness and stability to power the hips and minimize energy losses. Then to activate muscle quickly and relax quickly for speed and power. And then we're going to get into discussions of strongman events. How do you carry heavy loads? The heavy pushes and pulls, some of the grip strength work, which is absolutely seminal for strongman events. And, there's another interesting parallel with rowing where, my brain always goes to bigger grip strength, produces bigger backs and more deadlifting prowess, because you can bend the bar and use the lats and really unleash your back with big grip strength. And yet that may not translate to the rowing shell, where you're feathering the oar and playing the game of feel through the hands and whatnot. So again, this whole notion of what transfers from the weight room to the rowing shell, or what transfers from the weight room to any kind of real life athletic expression, is a very interesting question. And people assume too much, I think, when you look at our studies. You might be interested in this. We published a study and got an award for it last year, where we took a group of firefighters. They were actually the firefighters of Pensacola, Florida. And we teamed up with the Andrews Institute, who's a very powerful orthopedics institute in the U.S., and Athletes Performance, who are now known as Exos. And we took the fire department and we broke them into 3 training groups. One was a control group. One got trained in a style that you will know. They did repeated motions like burpees or something like that. And then they did 10 Olympic lifts. And we emphasized reps, not so much coaching precision of form. And then the third group were coached by the Exos coaches for every single exercise that they did, and they were coached on how to avoid injury mechanisms. So they were coached on frontal knee plane excursions, for example, which we know is an ACL injury marker. Sagittal plane spine motion, for example. And then before we started the trial, we measured them doing firefighting tasks like chopping a hole in the roof of a burning building, breaching open a door, piking open an overhead elevator door to extricate people from an elevator, for example. Then they did the 3 different training groups. Then we measured them we measured their increase in fitness, and the 2 training groups both got fit. But then we measured, how they performed their firefighting tasks, but we never coached firefighting. We wanted to measure the transference of athletic ability in joint sparing ways. The groups that were excellently coached got better in avoiding injury mechanisms when they did firefighting tasks. The guys who just did the burpees and the reps for reps actually had poorer form when they got back to the fire ground. So this was the first study that I knew of that quantified the transference of what goes on in the gym to, in this case, a highly athletic occupational physical demand. But it's the same with sport. So there was that thing about hand grip. What makes a great deadlifter? versus what makes a great rower. So these are all lots of things to discuss and have a lot of fun with. And I can absolutely guarantee, like everything in sport, what works for one may not work for the other. And if you have an absolute opinion, you must have a very, very homogeneous group of athletes, because athletes will always humble you. And once you think you have it all right, you might be pretty damn close with one athlete, but you'll mess up on the next. So keep an open mind, know your stuff, and you'll be a great coach.
Awesome. That's excellent advice. Well, that takes us through all the topics that we had down for this interview. Stu, thank you so much for taking the time to come on. As always, I learn something new every time I'm around you. So I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Just hang on the air. Let me give you a proper goodbye off air.
Okay.
I hope you enjoyed this brand new episode of the Leo Training Podcast. If you enjoyed this content, there's a couple things you can do moving forward to support this show. One, you can share this episode on your favorite social media network, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, or Instagram. Or I've recently signed up with Patreon, which is a membership site that allows you, the audience, to give back to me and make a small donation. So if you value this content, you find the information helpful in your own life or your own training, I greatly appreciate it if you could take a moment of your time, check out the links that are included in the show notes, and make a small donation to help the show continue to grow and move forward. And be sure to tune in next week when I have another brand new episode with Joel Proskowitz.
Thanks for listening to the Leo Training Podcast. Subscribe and get even more expert training tips at www.leotraining.io.